And so we want to, as always, be mindful and respectful of everyone's time and go ahead and begin. So this is a continuation of our community education series. Those of you who have been with us all the time, or at least most of the time, I think would agree that it's been very well delivered and very well received. So we appreciate you continuing to engage with us and hear the information that's being shared. As always, we've kept our promise to bring before you a speaker who is qualified and comfortable with talking about some of the things that we are wanting to learn more about. She has asked specifically that we not use a lot of honorifics in my introduction, so I won't do that. But I will tell you that uh, our presenter for this evening is someone that I consider not only a colleague but a friend, and who behind the scenes has contributed more than you might expect to the formation and the growth of our coalition with some of the advice and encouragement and support that she has given me. So I appreciate her being here. And so without any more from me, our speaker for the evening is Lisa Beeler from Clemson University.
Thank you, Daryl. And thank you all for allowing me to chat with y'all tonight. I met Daryl through an Ohio, kind of the state of Ohio, doing some DEI training. And I agree. I now consider Daryl a friend and a colleague also. And I appreciate each of your willingness to actually come on tonight on a Monday night where you could be watching Netflix or doing all kinds of things, right? But instead, we're here to stretch our thinking a little bit and learn a little bit more about language. The cool thing about what I'm talking about tonight is all of us are somewhat experts in the sense of we all use language. We all have been hurt or triggered by language. We all have listened to things that have inspired us that were really just language when we think about it. So know that all I'm going to do is kind of give us some things to think about. But know that you yourself already have a lot to contribute to the conversation. So I ask that you do. Please feel free to interrupt me. I have no problem with that. I would prefer this be a dialogue. And I'm the queen of waiting to get answers. My students say the silence, I kill them with silence. So I will probably wait if I ask a question until I have someone willing to kind of step up and talk a little bit about the question that I asked. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the importance of language. And I don't know that I have to really convince a lot of you all how important language is. I bet if I said right now, can you think of something that someone has said to you that maybe they said to you decades ago, and do you still remember it? I have no doubt that almost every single one of you can come up with something. Unfortunately, a lot of times those things are hurtful, but there's also things that have been said to us that were super inspirational or very encouraging. But language obviously is a powerful tool. So that's what I'm here to talk to you a little bit tonight. So just super quick about me, just so you know a little bit about me. I am from Central Appalachia. And I always joke that I never know, I can tell when someone from Ohio is actually from Appalachia because they say Appalachia, not Appalachia, but I'm just joking. Of course, you can be from, but that's language right there, kind of signaling that you must really be from Appalachia if you call it Appalachia. But I am from Central Appalachia in a little town called Luttrell, Tennessee. It's only about 1,000 folks that live there still. It's a limestone community. And we got one claim to fame. Any country music fans? We got Kenny Chesney. So small town. I mean, he's a pretty big deal. So we're proud of our Kenny Chesney. It even says it on the sign when you pull into our town. But apart from that, in mining, there's not a whole lot going on in Luttrell, Tennessee. And here's where I make, you all are muted, so I won't make you do it, but I make all my students go, "Aw," because here's my lovely, beautiful, wonderful family, my parents, my husband. I met the old-fashioned way on Match.com, which my students love to give me a hard time about that too. So that's enough about me. Officially, my official identity is I'm an assistant professor of marketing. I was at Ohio University till July, hence how I met Daryl. But now I've moved to Clemson University, and I really specialize specifically in DEI topics. How do you manage people in a way that is represented, well, is really inclusive? How do you do that? So I specifically focus on salespeople normally, but the research that I do is really about general management and how do you make sure that people feel included. Now, we all know that DEI topics can be uncomfortable for everyone, right? Maybe you're not uncomfortable talking about some things in a certain area, but other areas make you really uncomfortable. So what we do a lot of times, and y'all obviously are on the other end of how a lot of people feel about DEI, or you wouldn't be so involved in an awesome group like this, but we tend to tread lightly, right? We tend to set up ourselves, and this is a quote from someone else, but we try to set up ourselves to be inclusive as heck and assume that our crappy bias and stupid habits are going to creep in. But we all know we can do better, and that's why you all are in this group. But an easy way to do better is language. Some of the ways we can do better are going to take some time and effort. And language, in some ways, that's true too, because we got to break some of the bad habits that we've created. But in general, this is something tactically today you could change and do better. So for me, I love low-hanging fruit like that, in the sense of I love to be able to be like, yep, I can make this change today, this change today, this change today. And it actually makes people feel more included. So first, let's just talk about language. I think, since we were born, language has been a part of our life. So we don't think too much about it apart from using it, right? We're experts in using it, but maybe haven't stepped back and thought about what is language. Now, maybe I have some folks on here who are PhDs or masters in English or something like that. Then this may bore you to death. But I think, for most folks, we don't really think through the idea that language is really a social construct. So what I mean by that is we really name things to make sense, right? How could I even be talking to you right now if we didn't have a language to help us really understand what we were communicating? So for example, I like to ask, was a table born a table? Well, of course it wasn't, right? It was wood. But what was it if we didn't have the word wood? So in other words, this thing that my computer is setting on is only a table because us as humans have decided that it's called a table. But technically that word doesn't mean anything unless you add all of the perceptions and the experiences and all these things around it. That word doesn't really mean anything at all. We know that the meaning of words change, right? As people's view of them change, as experience change. So once again, just remember that language is a social construct in the sense of there's no, actual table. That's what we've called this thing that we have set things on top of. And the idea that experiences shape our understanding of language. So what did the word black mean when you were 6 versus what does the word black mean now? Maybe to most 6-year-olds, it means a color of a crayon. But obviously, in the situation and the things that are happening in our culture over the last centuries, Black and the experiences of Black folks in America has shaped how we view the word Black, right? So language change and shifts and shapes as we gather more information and as experiences happen throughout our lives. So somebody tell me, what is this?
Goldfish.
Okay. Dominic says goldfish. I disagree. I think it's a molgu guy. Or maybe it's a Pez or a pesky, right? So the idea that once again, this just kind of iterates that language really doesn't, it's a social construct. It means nothing without all of our understanding of what we've decided to call it and all of our experiences. So let's say that one of you happen to have a goldfish and it, currently, or maybe when you were growing up, maybe you automatically thought of a name of a goldfish, right? So your experience actually shaped how you perceive this thing that we call a fish in America, or a goldfish. Now, we know that language is based on perceptions. It's also based on context and history, okay? Language is learned. So we know that babies don't come out, unfortunately, being able to tell you they're hungry or anything like that, right? So over time it's learned, but that's good because it means we can unlearn language that may be a bad habit or harmful to certain folks. Language evolves, we know that, right? When you think about even simple words like gay, what meant in 1920s versus what it means now. So language evolves, right? It changes. It also shapes the way we interact within the world. So me just sharing that I'm from Appalachia changed the way you perceive me. Some of you may be good, some bad, but ultimately there are these perceptions tied with it. And we know that language has a lot of power. So if I say the black car next door is in the way, that probably doesn't evoke too much for many of you. She lives in a suburb. I don't know, maybe it does, but in general, probably doesn't evoke too much. It matters where you send the mail, probably doesn't do too much for you. But if I take a word from each one of those and put it together, all of a sudden this has different perceptions and different meanings and different thoughts and different experiences wrapped around these three words who, in the context of these other sentences, didn't really do anything for us necessarily. And we know that language is powerful in the sense of all we have to do is look at the news, right? Anything on the news, whether we're talking about a wealth tax or whether we're talking about racism or the pandemic, we know that language can be powerful and that it can really change our perception of the world. And we love how the media uses different kinds of language to kind of share a similar point, right? So some Christian nationalists are fueling their movement with, and then of course the Christian network during the tightest pandemic restriction, religious communities work to keep the faith. So when you read these stories, they actually talk about similar things, but the choice of language really gives us a different perception, right? A different tone, different perception of what's actually happening. So these may seem like extreme examples, but your day-to-day language can really make an impact on people in powerful languages. So hopefully you understand a little bit better about what are the components of language that may make it interesting in the context of DEI, but then also that language is powerful. And it's an easy way for us to change our behaviors today to actually make a difference. So we know language affects us in very real ways. Words can trigger thoughts or emotions. We all have memories of words that are said to us. We quit or join things because of words sometimes. Words shape our relationships, right? So language, I think that it's one of those things that it's so ingrained in our daily experience that we think very little about the strength and the power of the things that come out of our mouth. So how could we use words to build relationships and signal inclusion? Now, what I'm going to share today is either based on research or based on my observation. Not everything I share today will necessarily be something that you understand, or I shouldn't say understand, empathize with or agree with. And that's fine, because language is a personal connection in the sense of the things that shape it. Okay. So know that moving forward, there may be some examples that you don't really either A, understand in the sense of empathize with, or B, agree fully with. That's fine, because language isn't definite and finite. Now, one of the first things that you can do, though, is to stop using lazy language. And this is something that most of us are guilty of. So for example, it is not uncommon for someone to start a presentation to say, hey guys, right? That is typical vernacular that we all use in the English language. But I always kind of challenge my students, how weird would it be if I walked into a presentation and said, hey girls? Everybody would kind of give me the, wait a minute, that sounds off. This has become so entrenched in our language that we don't think anything of it. But it's lazy language because it suggests kind of a dominant masculine perspective of language. So I like to use folks, which my students say sounds like I'm from the 1800s, but I don't care. I'm going with it. So I like to say, hey folks, or, the folks over there. People is an easy one, like good evening, everyone, right? Those kind of salutations. Not that, most people say, hey guys, And does it make you a bad person? I just want you to start questioning maybe some of the words that we use that are so typical for us that we don't even question how certain folks might feel. So I actually had a student at Ohio University that was trying to recruit for a student organization. And this student spoke in front of the LGBTQIA largest student organization on campus. And she started with, "Hey guys." And a student actually pulled her aside after and said, "Hey, I know that it was not your intent, but know that, especially in front of this group of folks, that really kind of set a note with some of us that shut us off from the rest of the presentation, because we thought that maybe you hadn't thought enough through who you were talking to in your audience to really think about how your words might be perceived." Wasn't mean to her, wasn't mad at her. Great educational moment, I think, for the student to just rethink some of the ways that she addresses folks in presentations. A lot of times we say, they're not the normal, or she's not the normal, or they aren't the normal. I catch myself saying it. Probably a less lazy would be typical. So what is it if I say Amy's normal? Or Amy's normal, unlike, or let me think of a better way to say it. Well, she's kind of the normal example. Amy's the normal example. So if I say that, what am I suggesting if I'm referring to someone that's not Amy?
Not normal.
Right. So I'm kind of referring, instead of saying that Amy is more representative of a dominant group, right? Typical. I'm saying, well, Amy's normal, and because Amy's not, or Rebecca's not such and such, Rebecca can't be normal. So typical is a better expression of saying more like the group, like more like a dominant group. Minorities versus underrepresented. And this is something that actually I've had multiple people challenge me on this one. And once again, I think we're shifting in evolving language. But minorities, why do you think minorities might be a lazy way to say underrepresented or underserved?
I think one reason would be because it tends to group together actually a fairly large number of various groups.
Very good. So one aspect is minority makes it sound like, oh, there's only a few, where it kind of waters down the idea that there's a massive group of folks that, let's say, if we're talking about race, are not white, right? Okay. What other thing do you think would make minorities somewhat a lazy use of language?
To me, this is Don. To me, it's unclear. Underrepresented actually goes to the heart of what you're talking about, whereas a minority can still be powerful and be represented. But I think what we want is to define underrepresented.
Okay. So you're saying that underrepresented is a little less clear, correct?
No, I'm saying underrepresented is more clear because
Okay,
now we know
perfect.
what you're speaking to. Yes.
I got you. Yes. So underrepresented is a little more clear as to what we're speaking to. What about, good point, both Dawn and Daryl, what about the root of the word minorities? Any of you English folks or can take a stab, even if you're not an English or lit person?
Minor,
Yeah, so minor. So what does minor normally mean?
lesser.
Lesser. So for some folks, it's also kind of a trigger in the sense of we're saying that their group is less than. Now, the argument could be that, well, the group is less than in the sense of size. So that's where we get it kind of underrepresented, because now we're specifying it's less than because of size, not necessarily because of any sort of traits, characteristics, qualities, or anything like that. Now, you'll still hear a ton of people use the phrase minorities. And there's a lot of organizations that use that word in their title or slogan. But I do think, based on research and based on kind of commentary I've been reading, that the phrase is probably going to shift and evolve more to underrepresented or underserved, as opposed to minorities, to try to get away from that minor language.
If I might,
Yeah.
I would say that I would prefer the usage with underrepresented as an adjective describing a numerical minority, if in fact that's the case.
I'm sorry, I can't see who's speaking. I can hear you. I just want to make sure.
David Hamilton.
Okay, thank you, David Hamilton. So David said you would prefer the use of, please say that again.
I would prefer to use both terms together with underrepresented when it's the case, as it often is, describing a minority, which is to me simply a numerical fact, although I recognize that it has the implications of lesser.
Yes, but I think you're right, David. I think there's nothing wrong with clarifying if you do choose to use the term minorities, clarify the idea of numeric value, just like you said. I think that kind of does away with a lot of the issues that folks see in using the word by itself. So agreed with you. Thank you for that comment. Another thing you can do is choose words thoughtfully to decrease communication. I think a lot of times, and it's kind of, once again, something that we've gotten in a habit of, a lot of times we use words that really mean different things when we're trying to describe something. So I think a perfect example is the use of these 4 words, especially the first 3, as kind of similar ideas when they're distinctly different. So a lot of times we kind of dig ourselves a little bit of hole that's hard to get out of by using words that don't even actually represent what we intend to say. So choose your words thoughtfully. So for example, a prejudice is just a preconceived notion, right? So I can be prejudiced against Tom, Amy, Don, Daryl. I could be prejudiced against every individual on here for my own chosen reason. Discrimination is actually the treatment, right? So now we're moving into behavior. And especially on the grounds, we're starting to bring in the idea of identities in the sense of, especially on the grounds of race, age, etc. I think a lot of folks have a hard time really differentiating the idea of these terms and racism. So without clicking forward and looking at the definition of racism, what do you think is a key component that separates racism, for example, from prejudice and discrimination? Whether literally in the definition or the general idea of the definitions.
I would suggest that racism is much more about action,
Okay.
as opposed to thought or position.
Okay. So one difference is racism tends to be more behavioral, more outward. Okay. What else do you think is critical in kind of the difference between prejudice, discrimination, and racism?
I think racism is more specific than prejudice, that I may be prejudiced because of hair color, or, some other characteristic, age, gender, that sort of thing, whereas racism is pretty specific.
Very good. Anything else?
Racism demands an institutional structure behind it, while discrimination is individualized. Racism needs some power of enforcement in some way to be racist. It must be systemic also.
Very good. So Amy picked up on the thing that I think is most critical, which is power. So Amy talked a little bit about systematic racism also, right? The idea that there are systems in place that tend to discriminate against certain groups of folks. But when you really think about racism, power is key. So this is why, for example, choosing words thoughtfully is super important, because if you think about it, when you hear someone say, for example, and based on definitions, not opinion, for example, that white people can be racist, based definitionally, that is untrue, because white people, people can be racist against white people. Sorry. That is definitionally untrue because there lacks some sort of power. So the idea of racism, that it can be directed towards a group that is actually in power, definitionally does not match with what we're looking at. So this is just an example, but the idea of choosing your words thoughtfully and carefully, I think, is something that a lot of us could work on, including myself. So instead of, if at any point you're questioning a word that comes out of your mouth in the sense of, okay, that was a pretty strong statement, let me double check that discrimination really means what I think it means, just definitionally. Because a lot of us have used terms like prejudice, discrimination, and racism interchangeably, right? So we can stop with lazy language. We can choose our words very carefully. Here's another example. I think a lot of us use the words equality and equity in the same way, when really those definitionally are two very different things. So equality is the state of being equal, right? That all of us have equal status, rights, opportunities, fairness. Equity, on the other hand, is a right of access to resources to achieve equality. So, for example, I received a scholarship as a first-generation student in a town that historically does not go to college. If I had not received that scholarship, I don't know, because I wasn't in that situation, but I'm not sure I could have went to college. So that is an example of equity in the sense of I needed that scholarship to be able to actually go to college. So when we think about equity, it's more about providing the resources to make sure that everyone has an equal shot. Sometimes that means different resources for different people. So once again, I think equality and equity is a term that we throw around a lot in DEI conversations that can cause confusion or can cause, someone to get upset because we're using them wrong. So it's just a miscommunication. So anytime we can decrease miscommunication by just doing some quick definitional searches and making sure that we're using the correct words, obviously that is a simple thing that I think a lot of us probably could do easily. Also, do some research, don't assume. So for example, there's a survey that recently came out that said most people surveyed on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter prefer to be recognized as Black before African American or person of color. It took me 30 seconds to find that. So if I'm going to talk about Black people in America, I'm probably going to use the phrase Black based on what research says. I did quick, and these are all just examples. I did some quick research on to see folks that have same-sex partners or same-gender partners. They mostly prefer the use of the word partner as opposed to obviously saying husband, wife, or spouse, because those language elements have things around them that may not feel inclusive for those individuals. So I think just literally doing quick research, just trying to figure out what is the appropriate terminology, and then just be okay with being corrected, because there are folks that I have said Black American, and they've actually said, well, no, I prefer African American because I am African. But what is the problem with calling any individual with dark skin in America African American?
So everybody's not of African descent.
There you go. So, once again, it's a phrase that we've coined in America and use it. We don't think anything of it, but African American is combining, right, an ethnicity and a race together in a way that, for example, Black American, the person can correct you and say, actually, I'm Caribbean American. I would prefer, okay, no problem, right? So it's the idea of just do a little bit of research if you're unsure and don't assume, and then be okay with someone saying, I prefer such and such, right? I said I prefer not to be called doctor, which isn't the same thing, but there's nothing wrong with someone correcting you to just say, I prefer, right? Also, another thing I think that all of us can think about, and I've had to revisit a lot, I use a lot of phrases, things that we naturally say in speech. Consider the history of words and phrases. And here I focus specifically on racism and slavery in America, just because of the coalition kind of context here. But words like master bedroom, master's tournament, peanut gallery, I don't need any comments from the peanut gallery. It's a cakewalk, something sold down the river. All of these historically have some roots in either racism or slavery or all of the above. So I'm not saying you're a terrible person if you use master bedrooms, like, but think about I say main bedroom now. Like, that's just the way I say it. Easy change, no problem. But think about how some of these words, as we know words are tied to experiences and people's personal perceptions, all these things. These are easy fixes that we can just kind of knock out of our language, to try to be more inclusive. So did anyone actually kind of, you maybe used these words, but hadn't thought twice necessarily about the origin of them or how it might not be inclusive language? Because these are all very commonly used phrases.
I didn't know about cakewalk. I use that a lot.
Yeah, so I think that's a great example. I used it a lot too, till about 4 years ago when I educated myself a little bit, and I was like, oh, I didn't know historically that's where that came from. Any other words or phrases?
There was one in the chat there, Lisa.
Oh, perfect.
Amy,
Sorry, I
yeah.
forgot that that's even an option. Oh, very good, Amy. So grandfathered in, I almost put that one on here too. So, using the phrase grandfathered in, that actually was tied to a voting law, right? That ultimately roots directly in slavery. Dawn, did you have something to say? I saw you unmute.
I'm glad that Amy brought up grandfather clause. I actually explained that to several attorneys who've been practicing law for over 20 years. Nobody understood it. Went back to how voting rights were basically taken away, otherwise taken away. So thanks for bringing that up, Amy.
Yeah, absolutely. And literally, if you just go Google words rooted in slavery or racism, you're going to find, I just put a few right here that I knew were common for a lot of us to use. There's so many. So do you have to be perfect? No, but think about those phrases that come out of your mouth a lot, and maybe just go check really quick and make sure that they're rooted in something that could not be harmful or hurtful for individuals. All right. Let me move, sorry, with hosting capabilities here. There we go. All right. Don't include unnecessary language. So a lot of us include identifiers when there's really no need to. So unless it is pertinent to the story, as in because the person is Native or Black or 72 years old, or what, there is no reason really to include that identifier. So it's not uncommon, for example, to hear somebody say, yesterday I was sitting beside this Black woman and she did it, and just a regular old story, right? We don't need to know she's Black. So I think sometimes we have this, and I've tried to read some research on it. I don't know, maybe you all have some insights. I'm not sure if it's an uncomfortableness with people not like us. So it's heightened in our mind, and we, for some reasons, feel like we need to share that identity at the moment. But a lot of times we share those kinds of things really with it doesn't change the story for anyone. So just note if you do that and try to cut that out in the sense of there's no need to include unnecessary language that identifies people unless it actually shifts the story for some reason. This one is one of my favorites because my mother used to do this to me all the time. So this one is very pertinent and home for me. Let's say I was in the grocery store and I would comment on a woman's skin or something, say, Mom, her skin's dark. It would be the hush, the shh, shh. So, or whispering. I've noticed, and my friends sometimes I've noticed will whisper certain identifiers like he's Hispanic or he's Black. And that whispering, that note of this whispering, what do you think? And if some of you all have read White Fragility, she does a really nice job of talking about this. But what do y'all think that signals in us as humans? Not you as you're a terrible individual, but what do you think it signals in us culturally?
I think it says it's a thing we shouldn't talk about.
Very good. So Tom, did you want to add anything? Okay. So agreed. I think that's it, right? If for some reason, when we hush our children or, whisper certain identifiers, it almost sends a signal of this is something that we don't want to talk about. And as you all know, being in a group like this, you know how important it is to talk about these things. So I think anytime if you notice that one of your friends or maybe you hush the child, kind of question where that comes from, and once again try to change that behavior.
Lisa, if I could have a comment on that.
Yeah, please do.
I may be the only one comfortable enough to say this in this group, but I'm going to say it. Sometimes when we do use identifiers that are specific to race, Black or white, if it is pertinent to what we're relaying, my anecdotal experience is that sometimes people still whisper those, especially Black people tend to whisper if they say white, or they actually do like a motion of indicating skin tone.
Yeah.
And my reaction to that is, if it's relevant, say it. White people know they're white and Black people know they're Black.
Yeah.
So if it's pertinent to the conversation, include it in the conversation and say it out loud.
Yes, agreed. Absolutely agreed. So if Daryl is dead on in the sense of if it's pertinent, say it. If you're adding it, in my opinion, Daryl, you can share your opinion on this. If you're adding it and it doesn't change anything about the story, I would say drop it. What is your thought?
I agree.
Yeah, because there's really, in my opinion, I don't know what it adds to the conversation. But I would say I hear it a lot. Like I could name probably 5 to 10 times I've heard it over the last week. Just because, I think I was working on this PowerPoint, so I was recognizing all these things. But once again, these are habits we've created on our language. The good news is we can unlearn the same way we learned it, right? That's what's awesome about language. As it evolves, we can change it. So my suggestion would be tomorrow, pick 3 things that maybe you yourself felt a little convicted about. Oh, I kind of do that a lot and I probably should change that. And just start working on those small things. I don't think that anyone's asking us to be perfect because we know language evolves. We know it changes. We know it shifts. So you're never, and we also know that different folks have different perceptions of the same word. So even if all of your intentions are perfect and good, there may be someone that says, I don't really identify as how you just described me. If you don't mind, could you say, my partner moving forward? Sure, no problem, right? It's going to change, but I do think that this is one of the easiest ways. Language is one of the easiest ways to make people feel more included. It's something we have the control over today to change, but you got to give yourself a little grace. All you can do is try, continue to change, continue to be better. Research a little bit. Think through the things you say, especially those terms and phrases that you use a lot. And yeah, to me, it's one of the easiest things. So at this point, I want to ask, because I only have so much time, and language, like I said, is something that all of you can speak to, no pun intended. So with that being said, what are some other thoughts, maybe examples, ideas I know some of you are very well read in regards to DEI topics. What are some things you've read that you would like to add to the conversation? Or if there was something you didn't agree with, please feel free, because once again, language is a cultural concept.
Now's the time, folks. If you have thoughts or comments or something that you want to discuss.
I do have an exercise. I just want to share the floor.
I will say this, one of the things is we have to relearn a lot of stuff. In my dad's side of the family is 1/64th. We would now say Native American. As I was growing up, we would say American Indian or Indian, but now that's politically incorrect. And so part of it's just relearning a term you've used forever.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any ways, Dawn, not to put you on the spot, but do you have any ways that kind of, it sounds like you've thought about this, that you found are helpful for relearning?
Other than just thinking, it goes back to what you were saying earlier. When you walk in a room, I try never to say, "Hey guys," going back to your point. So I think you just have to consciously think about what you're saying so you don't have, just say, slips, and eventually you build up a habit, or you replace the terminology you used to use with the new terminology.
Mhm. Well, and I just had a moment when I asked you that, Dawn, because I just thought I use the phrase put you on the spot a lot. So now I know I need to go like Google just real quick, see what the root is, make sure that because that's something I use all the time. So I don't know the answer to that right now, but even that, right, is a tactic to start rethinking the language that has just been embedded in us for so long.
I mean, little things, and Daryl knows this. If you say we're tying the knot, well, what's that really mean? Again, it goes back to historic, just historic connotation. So.
Anita said it takes time to be very conscious about language and to interact with others who are different, and we can learn a lot about rethinking our language. Very good, Anita. I think a lot of DEI stuff, it boils down to we need to collaborate, communicate, and befriend people not like us. And I think language is no different in the sense of folks that maybe have grown up in a different area, so they use different language. Folks that maybe enjoy different things than you do. I mean, this idea of language being a social construct means that somebody who doesn't use, like, for example, I'm not sure my husband's going to be great at picking out all the things that I say incorrectly because we speak the exact same language. But having someone around to be able to kind of have those conversations with. Amy said, I'm practicing using they, them pronouns until I'm told otherwise, or ideally asking before I use a pronoun. Very good. So I focused a lot on race today in the sense of examples, but I think LGBTQIA community, another easy, like Amy said, not easy because it's hard in the sense of the plural, that, the singular to the plural. It's hard to kind of wrap our heads around that the way that we have done grammar for so long, but using they, them pronouns until told otherwise says, I see you, I hear you, regardless of how the person identifies.
I think one of the most important messages in tonight's session is granting people some latitude and in both directions. That we all come from different eras, different neighborhoods, and so on. And we've all learned different languages, and if we can grant somebody grace in the language that they're using, but feel comfortable in saying, I'd really rather you refer to me as, whatever. And everybody kind of, holster their weapons and say, okay, I'll try.
Yeah. And I could be wrong, but I do think genuine effort is what most people want to see. It's not perfection. It's genuine effort to try to make people through language feel included. And that's it, right? I have yet to see someone in an interaction where someone has tried, maybe got it wrong, and the person, go bananas. Like, I just haven't seen that, right? I think genuine effort. Yeah, agreed, Amy. I haven't seen it. I'm sure it happens. But I think the majority of interactions, if you honestly are being open and have a learning mindset and willing to try to shift your language, I think that's all most of us would ask for, most of us.
Hey, Lisa, good news.
Yes.
Being a person on the spot just goes back to the days of pirates. So
okay, good. I don't think I know any pirates. So.
Well, you can Google it yourself now, but
okay, good. I was like, shoot, did I just teach my own lesson? Which I would have been okay with that. Because that's why I said in the beginning, there's plenty of things that I still do that need to be shifted and evolved and shaped. And it's always going to be that way because I'm human. So Anita said, I stopped using minority years ago when referring to people of color because it often feels like lazy language and not taking the time to think of other terms. Yeah, agreed, Anita. Thank you for sharing that. So I have a few sentences that I just want us to kind of try. How would we say these? So it's kind of a how would we say these better situation. So still trying to get at the heart of what the person's trying to say in the sentence. And this is actually I'm happy to send it to anybody that wants it. This is an exercise that a researcher in the 90s created, but I still think it is so relevant for today. I changed some words, but the idea of the exercise is strictly from research. So how would you say this first sentence that still gets the point across, but drops some of what I like to call lazy language?
Just say all residents of, or,
There we go.
no, I don't know about all, but,
Yeah.
all demographics of Los Angeles were 10s.
Yeah. So the news is really good at identifiers and, really highlighting certain things to try to get readership or whatever. But here it's just residents. There's really no reason to differentiate those. I already spoiled the second one, so we can skip past it. But here, the lazy language is just the idea that what we really probably meant, if this is what we were saying, is can be prejudice, right? Can actually have a prejudice against someone else. But racism, you really lack that power in the sense of, I'm sorry, I flipped it again. I apologize. People can be racist against white people. I did the same thing I spoke earlier. So I was trying to get that point across, that white people can be victims of racism. That's not accurate, just based definitionally. What about this third one? And these are some things that were pulled out of like books, news articles, different things. What do you think might kind of be a better way to say this?
Really, Africans were brought as slaves to the
Very
colony.
good. Very good. So being more specific, folks were brought as slaves, right? They weren't slaves. What else might also be another tweak that would be a little better?
To recognize their personhood, you could say people who were enslaved.
Yeah, so you could talk about people who were enslaved. So leading with the person. I don't have an answer for this one actually, but like personally in this area, but I don't like the phrase, and this is a perception, someone can challenge me, to work in the rice tobacco fields. It almost makes it sound like they're getting paid.
Yeah,
so I don't love that phrase.
Yeah, the last part of that phrase is just unnecessary language.
Yeah, because exactly. It's like, wait a minute, work makes it sound like it was a transaction.
Right.
And then yes, it doesn't matter what they were doing. Ultimately, we're talking about people that were enslaved.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. What about the next sentence? Oh, there we go. Anita said people were brought here and forced into slavery. So that tells a truer, everything that you all have said and what Anita just said, that tells a truer story, right? Even though maybe the person was trying to get at that, the choice of language here makes a big difference. What about the underclass in ghettos and barrios need education and jobs? There's a lot going on with this one.
We could just say residents.
There we go. Residents of the area need education and jobs. Even that though, what else? The need education and jobs.
Well, the underclass concept is a whole theory about a culture of poverty and intergenerational poverty, cultural determinism. It embodies, as I say, a whole theory of social structure.
Yes, very good. So that word underclass, which I wouldn't say that I hear it a lot now, but has strong, it's, I mean, literally, it's the idea of determinism, racial determinism, which, you know, obviously is an issue. In the word ghetto, I feel like that's a word that a lot of people still use to refer to a I don't know, an area where maybe there aren't as many resources pumped in or something. The idea of calling anything a ghetto is lazy language in the sense of that's something with a lot of perceptions and connotations around it. What about need education and jobs? Anybody kind of see anything that might be a little
To me, it implies that they're the only ones that need education and jobs. You know, if you put it as well, or, you know, the same as everybody else or something like that, because we all need education and jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes, and maybe this is, you know, our different identities kind of make us perceive certain things differently. So I'll speak it to an identity that maybe this is hitting on me. I have a lot of family who I think the rest of the world might look at and think they need a lot of things. But if you ask them, they're totally fine. So I don't like the phrase, I don't know. Like I said, this may be a personal thing for me. But I would say maybe need more access to education and jobs or something like that. But here it almost sounds like we know better, you need this. And I don't love that language. But once again, that may be my personal kind of bias in how I see the world. What about the next one? Anita brought up a good one, and guess what, Anita? It's on my next slide. So that's the only reason why I'm not going to say it yet. Faculty who supported the strike were blacklisted from teaching.
Oh, man.
I heard somebody, oh man. Anybody have any comment about the issue here?
Well, blacklisted is in the same category as blackballed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the origin is. I don't know that it's necessarily racist.
Yeah, blackball, the origin gets back to voting a person into a club, and you would
Right.
put a white ball or a black ball in. And I never knew it blacklisted as being, it might be a word we're uncomfortable with, but I didn't know there was any racial overtone to it.
Anybody have any thoughts?
In general, I think colors, black is negative and white is positive, just over the course of what we've learned. And any term
Absolutely.
you put black before it usually intends some kind of negative connotation.
But
Very good.
if your business is operating in the black, though, that's solid. That's very good. Versus the red, you know, which is the ink.
So,
That's true.
who was speaking? I'm sorry. Once again, it wasn't popping up on mine.
Oh, I'm Christine. And then
Oh,
Dawn.
Thank you, Christine. So, as Christine and Anita noted, it's really not necessarily that it's rooted in racism, but the idea that a lot of our words in our culture, black is associated with negative or bad connotations, and white associated with positive, good. So once again, this could be something that someone says, I don't necessarily understand or perceive it this way. But I do think a lot of our ideas about color, as in the actual color, not identities of color in America, are really something that we just need to think about as we use this language. Okay.
I happen to be left-handed, and the ancient association in English or Indo-European languages of left with sinister is a historical linguistic fact. It doesn't mean that I accept my left-handedness as somehow being sinister in a moral sense. I think we have to be a little bit careful about whether we think there still are moral connotations, racial connotations to certain historical terminology.
Sure. And I think that's a fair point, David. that the words in general, depending on roots, depending on perceptions, there is a question of where do we draw the line? And I think that's a question in the sense of a lot of DEI conversations. Where is that balancing act between inclusion versus what the other, that we have to be so quote unquote politically correct, or, that it's so hard to navigate the world. So I think it's a fair point. I think that there's absolutely certain folks on this side and certain folks on that side in the sense of research and where folks lie. Most researchers, the black, white in America, kind of the perceptions around the words that a lot of times, but completely agreed with, and I'm left-handed, so I don't know what you're saying about me, but, but I think it's a very fair point. And it's something that we're all grappling with. You can only do so much research, only do, what is the line? So I think it's a fair point. So I wanted to make sure that I'm still staying kind of in racial identity, but I wanted to make sure that I'm thinking about some other examples instead of just thinking about Black Americans and white Americans. So what is wrong with this first one? Columbus discovered America.
It only makes sense from a European perspective. There were people already here.
Right. So, I mean, Columbus arrived here on a ship, but discovered the problem, right? In the sense of there were already individuals here. So, there's other ways to say it that we could probably do better. U.S. foreign policy brings democracy to third world nations. And I'm going to add in, my air conditioner is broke, but that's a first world problem.
I think that has a lot to do with a ranking system that assumes that first is better, second is lower, third is at the bottom, and fourth world or whatever. That sort of assumes that our perception of ranking is correct, or,
I think
it's a label like, yeah.
I think the term originally started with economists who were trying to define the capability of nations. And you're right, it's a hierarchy of how developed your nation is, but it really is not a clear and accurate term.
Mm-hmm.
If I could say something that may seem a little off topic, Lisa, but
I
think it kind of helps make the point. And that is, I think that is a uniquely not only Western, but American frame of thinking. I kind of rank that alongside or rate that alongside the idea, if you're a sports fan, of the teams that compete in the U.S. and never leave U.S. soil, never compete against a team from any other country, and declare themselves world champions at the end of a season. That's a U.S. thing.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't happen to my knowledge in any other country except here, where we never set foot in anyone else's domain, but we declare ourselves champions of the entire planet. Just saying.
Any other thoughts? I think that's a really good point. And once again, language is so normal. The language here is so typical to us that ultimately, we don't question these things until you meet someone that maybe isn't American and they're like, wait, what? You're world champions. You've never played soccer over here once.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's a good point. So y'all have hit on the points in the sense that the idea of this ranking system, and even saying something like first world problem, you're insinuating that, for example, people in countries that may not seem as economically developed as America, that they don't have the same issues we do, that they don't have air conditions break sometimes. They don't have, it's almost a distancing, or you can't relate because obviously in the third world, they're living a totally different life. And I think that that distancing can be harmful when we actually think about how we help countries in any sort of way if we decide to do that as individuals, not as America. What about we celebrate our democratic ideals that all men are created equal?
Guess leaving out women would be a big deal here, right?
Yeah, there you go. So that all people are created equal, right? Okay, being a part of their culture. So when we take something and say such and such is my spirit animal, it's somewhat demeaning, right? Or appropriating, I think is a better way to say it, Amy, to cultures that's actually a very critical part of their culture. I can't believe the ring I bought was fake. He gypped me.
It's derogatory toward those who classify as gypsies. It's just like Jew them down is derogatory.
Yep. So that's a good
Jewish people.
Yep, that's a good example that coincides with that, Anita, is that ultimately, in America, I think a lot of times we have kind of a racialized lens that thinks only of the folks that we have in America that we see on the news, and right, which a lot of times lends our perception to Black Americans and white Americans. But there's a lot of other terms that don't necessarily have roots in white or Black race that are still very offensive to other groups that, of course, live in America. So at this point, I think that's all I got. I just wanted to kind of practice thinking through some of the things we say. Hopefully I was helpful. And if y'all have any questions for me, you can ask them now. You can reach out to me later, totally up to you. But it has been a pleasure. I appreciate all the things that you are willing to chat with me about. And if nothing else, if you leave just kind of rethinking some of the phrases you use, the things you say, and how you might decide to be more inclusive in certain ways, I think that was my hopeful goal for tonight.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. And Don, I was thinking you probably have to think a lot about words as a lawyer.
Well, actually, because my wife makes sure that I try to use the right terms. And again, it's a learning process, not using words like Oriental, again, Indian. I mean, there's just a lot of things you got to relearn. Yeah.
Yep. Well, Daryl, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Again, I think you see we have a fairly well-informed group here that tends to ask good questions, but also add to the conversation. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate your time with us today. And again, I would just say to the group, Lisa has really been a good support for me, not only for this particular presentation, but really in helping to develop our community education series. We spent a fair amount of time talking about that and how it should work and how it could work, what it might look like. So I really appreciate that. And Lisa, I think we are proud to say that we've had pretty good attendance over these months. It kind of waxed and waned, but I know that we've also had quite a fair amount of people who have viewed our sessions after the fact, viewed the recordings through the library system. So we're excited about that. And some other communities are looking at doing similar things based on the model that we've created and promoted for these past months. So the last couple of things, unless anyone else has any comment, that I would just reiterate for folks, and we're about at our time, is just reminding you of a couple of things that Lisa shared with us. One of them is just the history of words and phrases. You don't have to be, a big scholar to do that, but just take a little bit of time. As she mentioned, if there's some phrase or term that you use regularly, just take the time to kind of look up, where it originated, where it came from, and those kind of things, and be mindful of that. The other thing that I encourage folks to do, though, in the interest of change and commitment, which is kind of, some of our driving principles, and that is once you learn something, be committed to using it, to practicing it, and that influences other people. I can tell you there's some phrases that I use that, in my workplace professionally that are more correct than terminology that we used years ago. And I can't force anyone to adopt it or force them to believe it or like it. But what I can do is be consistent in how I use it and when I use it, and use it all the time. And it starts to influence at least some of the people around me. And if we are going to impact our community in a multiplicity of ways, that's one of the simplest things we can do, is be mindful of our language and practice what we learn as we interact with folks around the community. So again, we appreciate your time and your willingness to join us and engage with us today. So thanks everyone. And for those who are interested in our meetings, we will be meeting tomorrow evening, our regular meeting time at 6 for the executive committee and 6:30 for other folks who want to join us and hear what we're talking about tomorrow. So, and our next session for the community education series will be in October. And so look out for the invite for that. So thanks everyone and have a good night.